to see you. This is Garrity Lansing. I'm the head of BTG's Timberland Investment Group, otherwise known as TIG. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event, Large-Scale Conservation and Climate Action in the U.S. I think we have something like 300 people on the line here today. As long-term owners and managers of sustainable working forests, we believe a focus on climate change and biodiversity is fundamental to our mission. And this being the case, we are thrilled to be joined by an exceptional group of panelists to explore the science underlying solutions to these challenges. Now investors can play a critical role in bringing these solutions to scale. In addition, we have an exciting announcement regarding what we believe is a very impactful joint initiative of TIG and the Nature Conservancy. So to tell us more, it's my great pleasure to introduce Charlotte Kaiser, Managing Director of Inscreva-se at the Nature Conservancy, Dr. Kat Burns, Senior Conservation Director of Inscreva-se at the Nature Conservancy, and Mark Wishney, Chief Sustainability Officer and Head of Landscape Capital at TIG. So Charlotte, over to you.
Thanks so much, Garrity, for that kind introduction. I am so excited to be here with you today and to have the honor of unveiling this great news. The Nature Conservancy is thrilled to be joining forces with TIG to deliver on the enormous potential of sustainably managed forests for biodiversity and climate. TNC is going to serve as a conservation advisor to TIG's core timberland strategy in the US, which amounts to nearly 530,000 acres of working forests, an area more than 35 times the size of Manhattan, where I'm sitting. We will bring TNC's conservation and carbon science to TIG's sustainable forest management expertise to drive enhanced climate and conservation outcomes across this whole land base. Our initiative is going to be addressing the twin crises of biodiversity loss and climate change by conserving critical landscapes and driving climate action across the United States. TNC has a long history of developing new solutions for the world's urgent environmental threats, solutions that are led by our values and grounded in our science. There's an enormous opportunity in natural climate solutions in particular, which use the power of nature to store carbon through science-based conservation, restoration, and land management actions. Natural climate solutions are powerful, cost-effective, and most important, can be put to work right now. While we definitely need to pursue every tool available to rapidly decarbonize our economy, science tells us that nature is one of our best options in the response to the climate change today. And in particular, while it's true that outright protection of standing forests is a critical component of addressing the climate change threat, improving the management of working forests opens a huge opportunity to maximize the climate and biodiversity contributions of a widely held financial asset class. And this is so exciting because this is where investors can really make a difference. Timberland is a fundamental component of our economy, producing essential lumber and paper products. And if we can make nature an investment, we open up a clear path to climate and biodiversity action at scale.
Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you for that. And of course, we absolutely agree. TIG has a history of sustainably managing timberland assets that seek to generate risk-adjusted returns for some of the world's leading institutional investors. We're one of the world's largest and oldest timberland managers with $4 billion in assets and commitments and nearly 3 million acres under management throughout the US and Latin America. The commercial forest industry knows how to manage landscapes at the scale required, but investors are increasingly looking for positive social and environmental impacts that go above and beyond business as usual, in addition to returns from their investments. And increasingly, they're searching for ways to align their portfolios with the goals of the Paris Agreement. We believe that investment in nature may be a critical part of the answer. The goal of our initiative with TNC is to demonstrate that it is possible to manage forests in North America for climate and biodiversity impacts while also delivering financial returns from investment in sustainably managed forests. We believe that doing this successfully can help accelerate the deployment of private capital into climate and nature positive investment. Now I'm pleased to pass the screen to Dr. Kat Burns, who will share some of the science underpinning this initiative.
Thanks, Mark. Hi, everyone. I'm excited to be talking with you today. I'd like to give you a sense for what this collaboration is going to look like in practice, what sorts of outcomes we're working towards, and how the Nature Conservancy will help TIG meaningfully tackle the climate change and biodiversity crises that we've been mentioning. But first, why are we launching a forestry-focused effort to address these challenges? Why the focus on forests? So I want to show you one figure that I think illustrates this point really well. In this recent publication that was led by my colleague, Joe Fargione, scientists from across the country found that forests represent the largest cost-effective natural climate solution. and they provide significant co-benefits for biodiversity, soil, air, and water. So if you look at this figure, the climate mitigation potential is shown by the size of the bars, and each bar represents a different type of natural climate solution. So you'll see in the red box that we've got natural forest management and avoided forest conversion, both having really considerable potential to mitigate climate change. So if we want to mitigate climate change, we want to do it with natural climate solutions, a focus on sustainable forestry just makes a lot of sense. So the collaboration between the Nature Conservancy and TIG will focus on these two primary pathways to mitigating climate change. But in the process, we will also be providing climate benefits and biodiversity benefits in other ways. And we'll talk a little bit about those. So you might be wondering what this collaboration will look like on the ground in our working forests. Now, working closely together, we'll be looking to achieve a number of different things. One of those is increased opportunities for land protection and restoration, enhanced resilience for natural communities in the face of climate change, increased carbon storage and carbon market potential. We also are going to be looking to achieve improved water quality and more vibrant rural communities where forests can provide a critical source of jobs in the timber industry as well as for recreation. Now, really importantly, we will be creating a conservation and climate vision that's tailored to each of TIG's properties in the strategy based on the Nature Conservancy's scientific assessment of the conservation potential and the carbon potential associated with each one. So it's very investment specific. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about how the Nature Conservancy will support TIG in achieving more sustainable forest management and providing for these types of outcomes. Our role in this collaboration is as a conservation science advisor. So I'll be serving as the chair of a conservation committee that has membership from the Nature Conservancy and TIG that will establish conservation criteria that are applied to existing assets as well as proposed new acquisitions. We will also be establishing conservation goals for every property, and we'll be looking for the opportunities to have dispositions that include long-term protection. So the Nature Conservancy has a dedicated team that sits within NatureVest that I'm part of that has supported similar collaborations in the past. We also have local teams at TNC that are really deeply embedded in these landscapes and have experience with forest management that delivers for biodiversity and for climate. So the Nature Conservancy is bringing to this partnership and this collaboration our top-notch science expertise and our strong connections with conservation partners in all 50 states. So here's one example of the type of science that the Nature Conservancy will be bringing. And don't dwell on all the details here. I just want to give you a sense for the scale of some of the science that we're bringing. Over the past decade or so, the Nature Conservancy scientists across the US have used really sophisticated spatial analytics to identify top priority lands to protect, to achieve climate resilience and biodiversity conservation across the US. And that's what this map is showing. This analysis, as you can see, is very broad geographically, but it was conducted at very fine spatial scales, small enough to inform forest investment and forest management at the individual property level. So we're looking forward to seeing this type of analysis and other TNC science products informing TIG's investment strategy and forest management decisions going forward. Now, I'll close by saying that I think the science is clear regarding the urgency of the climate and biodiversity crises and regarding the critical role that natural climate solutions like sustainable forestry need to play in addressing these crises. So together, the Nature Conservancy and TIG, we're really excited about this collaboration, and we believe that this initiative will develop new approaches for working forests to deliver benefits for people and the planet. So with that, I'll pass it back to Mark.
Thank you very much, Kat, for sharing some of that critical conservation science that underpins both the TNC TIG initiative and also the broader challenges that we're confronting. And thank you, Charlotte, for joining us today and for your continued collaboration. I'd now like to turn to the panel discussion. That's the primary focus of today's event. As Kat has alluded to, and as decades of science and increasingly current events make clear, the climate and biodiversity crises are perhaps the most urgent challenges we face. In the US, forests and forest products capture and store nearly 15% of the country's carbon emissions, and according to American Forests, they have the potential to capture nearly twice as much if efforts are undertaken to plant trees and adopt climate-smart practices for managing working forests, among other actions. And as we've noted, institutional investors are increasingly searching for ways to align their portfolios with the goals of the Paris Agreement and positive social and environmental impacts. More than $43 trillion in assets and investment portfolios have already been committed to net neutrality by 2050 under the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance and the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative. So how can this capital be activated to help drive natural climate solutions to scale? To help us explore these challenges and opportunities, I'm thrilled to introduce a very distinguished set of panelists. Let me begin by more completely introducing Dr. Kat Burns, Senior Conservation Director for the Nature Conservancy's NatureVest team. At NatureVest, Kat leads efforts to bring TNC's conservation science to inform institutional investment partnerships focused on forestry and agriculture that aim to deliver impact alongside returns. Kat joined TNC in 2010 and previously served as the Associate Director of TNC California's Water Program and as the Director of Science for TNC's North Carolina chapter. Prior to joining TNC, Kat held faculty positions at Duke University and at the University of Maine. She also has extensive experience working in Australia, Africa, and Central and South America. Kat earned her PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology from Yale University, where she was a National Science Foundation Fellow, focusing on forest management and small mammal ecology, and holds a BS in biology from Emory University. Adam Bendel is CEO of Tonic, a global action community for impact investors that we'll learn more about in just a moment. Adam joined Tonic from his role as Chief Innovation Officer for FTI Consulting Incorporated, a New York Stock Exchange listed global consulting firm. Prior to FTI, Adam was CEO and co-founder of Strategic Discovery, an electronic discovery innovator, and before that co-founded and served as president of SV Technology, a software startup, after serving as Chief Technology Counsel for Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher. Adam holds a GD from the University of Chicago and a BA from Cornell University. And finally, Chris Varco is a managing director in the Sustainable and Impact Investing Group of Cambridge Associates, a global firm providing investment advisory services to endowments and foundations. Chris works on investment research and implementation in client portfolios across the ESG and impact spectrum. Prior to joining Cambridge, Chris was a partner at Montpelier Investment Management, an alternative investment fund in London, investing in emerging markets, and was also the program director at the related Montpelier Foundation, set up as a family office in London, making social and environmental impact investments and grants in emerging countries, the UK and the US. Chris holds an MS in International Management from King's College London and a BA in Biological Sciences from Oxford University. A quick note as we begin the discussion, we encourage attendees to submit questions via the Q&A function in Zoom, and we'll get to as many questions as we're able. So with that, Adam, if I could start with you, could you begin by just telling us a little bit about Tonic, the work that it does, how you work with your members, and then perhaps comment on how your members are thinking about climate and biodiversity in their investment portfolios?
Okay, thank you, Mark. I'm happy to do that. So first of all, what is Tonic? We are a global collection of active impact investors, primarily high net worth individuals, family offices, and foundations who are deploying capital towards social and environmental goals very broadly. And so this whole area of conservation, finance, and so forth is actually represents a kind of a subset of interests of Tonic members. And what we do together is, first of all, provide educational resources. So that includes, we have actually a very comprehensive introduction to impact investing generally for people who are just getting started. And then for those who are further along, we invite experts to kind of inform investment decision making. And then the second piece of our puzzle is sharing investment opportunities and co-investment potentials. We do that largely through working groups. In the conservation area, we've got 3 active working groups, one on climate, one on ocean health, and one on regenerative agriculture. and actually are starting a nature-based solution event series to go into greater depth on natural capital strategies and to source deals. The third bit is what we call impact support. So we've built a platform that our members can use called Tracer that facilitates their impact management across the portfolio. And really at the core of it all is community, sharing strategies and finding like-minded investors in both live, at least in the old days and maybe future days, and certainly virtual events, and in our private online platform. So that's a little bit of who we are and what we do really around the world. And to your question about sort of how our members are thinking about climate and biodiversity in their portfolios, Mark, I'd say there's kind of two broad approaches. One is some who overlay climate and biodiversity as a kind of filter across their entire portfolio, while they may be focusing on other issues primarily, like gender equity or access to healthcare, affordable housing, poverty alleviation, and so forth. And then for others, climate or biodiversity are the primary focus. And that can range from including some investments with explicit climate or biodiversity goals to aligning all capital against this set of priorities. So that's kind of an overview.
Great, thanks. And so there's a couple points there to come back to, but let me ask a similar question to Chris. Chris, for those who don't know Cambridge Associates, could you just tell us a little bit about who Cambridge Associates is, what are the sorts of institutions you work with, and then maybe say a little bit about how your clients are thinking about climate and biodiversity in their investment portfolios.
Sure. Thanks very much, Mark, and thanks to TIG and TNC for hosting this event. We're a global investment advisor, advising universities, endowments, foundations, single-family offices, and pension schemes across all asset classes. I'm based in London. We're based in Boston as our headquarters, and it's really a privilege to work with some of the leading asset owners, who often bring so much scientific and environmental knowledge to this discussion. TNC is one of them. We're very privileged to work on the endowment of TNC. And in the UK, where I'm based, we work for the endowment that owns the Guardian newspaper, that's been at the forefront of engaging on the climate issue. And I'm very lucky to work also with the National Trust, which is a sort of TNC equivalent, which is amazing. They're looking at climate and they are aiming to be carbon neutral by 2030. This is an institution with 500 properties and country houses, not Downton Abbey, pretty much everyone except that. But 800 miles of coast, 700,000 acres of land, and we're just on this incredible journey where they're going to be carbon neutral from the gift shop and the coach parking in their operations through to their endowment. So that's what we're doing, and I think what we've really seen is just this step change from what not to own. My first week at Cambridge Associates at the start of 2016, the member of the science faculty of one of the largest universities in the UK went on hunger strike to divest from fossil fuels. The investment committee was convened and they divested from fossil fuels. That science professor, unknown to him, will have made tens of millions of dollars, because that spurred an entire investment process that really evolved from what not to own to a much more holistic approach to climate alignment. Not just the 5% of fossil fuel producers, but what about the other 95%? So it's been really a move from black and white issues to what we call whatever it takes. You don't need to have a net zero policy, you need to have a net zero strategy.
Terrific, and let's definitely come back to that and what that net zero strategy might imply. Kat, I want to just ask you, in your role at NatureVest, you work on a number of strategies where you're providing support to institutional investment programs, and particularly around climate and biodiversity, conservation science is of course critical. What do you see as the contribution to conservation science led by TNC and others? What contribution can that make to some of the questions that the institutions that Adam and Chris work with might have? How can that help institutions address some of these goals in their portfolios?
Sure. A couple of thoughts come to mind. The first is, I think these kinds of collaborations, working closely with groups like the Nature Conservancy can really help change the vision for what a great investment looks like. Conservation science allows us to identify new opportunities that are true win-wins for business and for nature. So, I think rather than sticking with the old search image, with the technological advances in particular, we now have spatial information around the globe that helps us identify those places where investment is most likely to meet business needs and create positive impact. So I think these kinds of collaborations that really harness the power of technology and the new spatial information that we have is really valuable. The other thing I'll touch on is it relates to how real assets are managed. The Nature Conservancy as a land trust, we have decades of experience managing our own portfolio of properties and informing the management of others. So our approach is driven, heavily by science, by experimentation and adaptive management that informs, how we approach managing land and water to provide nature benefits. And, I think that the Nature Conservancy and others like us can bring that same science to inform how investments are managed. And in the process, identify some new ways that owners can manage investments to create additional benefits that maybe we hadn't thought about before, and that don't have to compromise their financial goals.
Yeah, and I think on that last point, I think that all of these institutions that are seeking to neutralize their portfolio still have their obligations to their pensioners or their constituents. And so to really unlock this huge amount of capital, which is trying to move in this direction, it seems like finding ways to deliver these other benefits while still meeting those financial targets is key. Adam, coming back to you, Chris made reference to sort of a step change, I think was the phrase you used, Chris, in sort of how institutions are focusing on and thinking about climate. I'm wondering if you would agree, and it seems like very much that attention on these issues among the investor community has really ramped up in the last 12 months or 18 months. I'm wondering if you're seeing that among your members, and whether for the time that you've been working in impact investment, how you've seen sort of impact investment evolve, and what it might contribute to this moment.
Yeah. Okay, now it wants me to unmute myself, but I'll do that later because I'm already unmuted. So, if you rewind, even further than that, Mark, impact investing as a term has probably been around now for 15 years or so. And when it was first introduced, impact investors really, thought about themselves in a kind of single asset class approach, early stage equity investments, maybe primarily in social enterprises, in difficult to invest in parts of the world. And that was then, and now I think most investors are taking a portfolio approach and considering their thematic focus across asset classes. So, in the natural capital area, that's obviously most commonly targeted in the real assets asset class, but it's increasingly available in private equity and debt. So I think that that's the kind of the big picture trend. And then, as I said, we've got folks who are really focused on this as their primary issue. Others who are treating it as a kind of overlay across the whole portfolio, and people go in varying levels of depth. Maybe an interesting example is one of our members based in Hong Kong, RS Group. They're a mid-sized Hong Kong-based family office, and their mission's to create a paradigm shift in people's values so that economic growth will support instead of jeopardize human development and environmental sustainability. And so not only are they deploying their capital with that in mind, but they're doing grant funding to develop bottom-up project-based business models for communities to prevent erosion of natural capital and to scale innovative natural capital solutions to make them more investable by institutional capital. They've got a program to strengthen the talent pipeline for the natural capital sector. So they're ensuring that there's a viable career path for students and young professionals who are passionate about natural capital. And so, that's an example of a member that is really taking a holistic approach to natural capital, not just looking at it as the kind of divest lens that Chris, referred to as a kind of earlier model.
And Chris, maybe following up on that, you mentioned sort of initially a lot of the thinking was around sort of a negative screen. What do you exclude? Where has the thinking developed from there?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen a step change with people, having much more holistic carbon policies, and it evolved, as I said, beginning with divestment and then setting net zero and more climate aligned emissions based targets. Then it's interesting, you find that it's surprisingly easy to remove 80% of the carbon emissions from your portfolio. We've done it with multi-billion institutions, and I would guarantee that most people on this line, if you move your passive equity to climate aligned indices, you're targeting low solutions, more investment in green technologies, climate momentum, and reorganize your active managers. There are some easy wins. So it begins with some simple rebalancing, and that's sort of appreciating that risk has changed. It's not, volatility is not a very good measure of directional, non-mean reverting risks like climate and ecological crises. And then a lot of big institutions, then they sort of pause and they realize, well, we can't just be overweight IT and healthcare and underweight industrials and utilities. We need to be part of the solution. And then that's coming in many ways. I have a client that has really redefined what diversification means. And again, it's not really going to be found on the efficient frontier because they're thinking about climate risk. They're doing a lot of climate scenario analysis. And they didn't really like liquid diversifiers anyway. They didn't like hedge funds. So they've actually allocated more of their illiquidity to be part of the solution. They've got a 10% sustainable real assets infrastructure allocation. So that's investing in everything from greenfield renewables, green hydrogen, reforestation. We'll get to that in a minute. Then in private equity and venture capital, again, creating a dedicated part of that to be investing in solutions, where there's everything from controlled environment, food farming. We've just backed an amazing food tech venture capital fund doing everything from alternative protein to really interesting technologies around controlled environment, mitigation, banking, sustainable clean tech, private equity. That's not a problem at all, as we all probably know. There's been sort of some multi-billion raises around climate capital and private equity, growth equity this year. And there's lots of really compelling managers that are on sort of fund 3 and 4. But then a lot of clients we've got to the stage where we're thinking we want to be really progressive. I have clients that have a 2030 net zero target, and then their diversified portfolio of liquid and illiquid assets is not really getting there fast enough. So we're thinking about some new asset allocations where we're actually thinking of carbon sink allocations. There's lots of accounting challenges around carbon avoidance versus carbon removed that I don't want to get into, but we've got a lot of clients that are really recognizing the benefit of large scale carbon removal, and with other technologies not there yet. It's interesting how lots of clients with an ambitious target to move ahead of national targets like 2030, 2040 are increasingly looking at things like regenerative forestry, sustainable forestry, and which is interesting. So we're doing a lot of work on that, and it's quite staggering. And Mark, you've been a great thought partner. The maths that we're finding that how effective natural capital solutions can be in storing carbon that we're producing in the rest of the portfolio.
That's a good lead in. Thank you for that, Chris. And that's a good lead in to a question for Kat. which is maybe following on that, as we're thinking about how to activate private capital for natural climate solutions and to address biodiversity, and as Chris just mentioned, there's a way in which some of these conversations with investors sort of naturally lead to a focus, at least in the near term, on forestry and ag and other natural climate solutions as carbon sinks. Do you have thoughts about where or how private investment could support large-scale conservation strategies that TNC or others in the conservation community are pursuing? Where do you see private capital potentially playing a significant role?
Sure, that's a good question. To be honest, from my perspective, when I look at the role that nature plays around the world in supporting things like our economies and health and well-being, it's literally everywhere. So I actually think the opportunity space is literally anywhere. We've talked a bit today about how forests are really already providing essential products like timber, carbon storage, and natural habitat. If we look at agriculture, soil health is really critical for our ability to feed people on an ongoing basis around the world. We need to keep our water cleaner and use less of it. So we've got enough for nature as well as for people. In our oceans, we need well-managed fisheries to provide income and sustenance for people all over the world. And nature itself is the basis of tourism economies pretty much anywhere you go. So, I think for those that are wanting to create more impact, through private investment, I honestly think there's endless opportunities. I'm very excited about the collaboration with TIG that we're announcing today in the forestry space. But I think whatever sector you're focused on and where you have the expertise and the interest, there are ways to make impact and to build impact into your business. I think you just have to look for those opportunities, bring in good allies, and private capital really has an important role to play here in solving these problems.
Thank you for that. So we're hearing a lot. You showed us, like, Kat, in your opening, showing how large the potential opportunity is in natural climate solutions, and we've been hearing from Chris and Adam about how much investor interest there is that's sort of growing in this space. So a question for Adam, and maybe Chris, you could address this as well. But what are the barriers? What are the limits that you're encountering as clients, investors, advisees are looking to move their portfolios or make investments in these directions? What are the barriers they face when looking at natural capital or natural climate solution kinds of opportunities?
So in a way, I think I might answer that by reframing the question that you asked to Kat of sort of how can private capital help sort of put its weight behind science-based solutions. And the question is sort of in the reverse: how can science-based insight guide private capital? So the crowd of impact investors that we represent generally don't have on staff the kinds of folks that Chris was talking about, that these larger institutions have in terms of a science-based staff that can guide them. And so how to incorporate science into due diligence and portfolio construction is actually a significant impediment for those who don't have access to those resources. Are they likely to be more impactful investing in the rainforests in the Amazon or in the Pacific Northwest? Should they deploy capital in mangrove restoration or rather invest in onshore aquaculture shrimp farms that alleviate the pressure on farmers clear-cutting mangrove forests, and so forth? And so these are really hard questions for non-scientists to answer. And even if you're well-intentioned, you may not have access to the kinds of resources that are needed to answer those questions. And one other quick example I'll give is, I think, a lack of understanding of ecosystem markets, like carbon markets, blue carbon for ocean carbon sequestration, regenerative agriculture, carbon credits. What are the different risks between voluntary and regulatory markets? How do you make sense of what seems to be a pretty fragmented market in that regard? And so I guess those things are both kind of under the heading of support that private investors need if they are even motivated, as so many are, to invest in this way.
Yeah, thank you for that. As a colleague once told me, he's never had a conversation about forest carbon that didn't end with somebody saying, but of course it's more complicated than that. And I think that that's a barrier that we face in these discussions. Chris, let me ask you the same question about barriers, but before, I've gotten a reminder from the host to remind the audience to please submit any questions you have to the Q&A. But Chris, from your perspective, what are the barriers that your clients face or your advisees face in looking at natural capital and natural climate solutions opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of them are perceived barriers rather than real ones. Timber, a lot of the real solutions to climate change and natural problems, are in the real assets, infrastructure asset class. That in the sort of classical endowment model was the inflation sensitive bucket, and it's very interesting. But what went in there? A lot of upstream oil and gas, and I think the perception of what an inflation sensitive and what a core infrastructure asset should be has changed surprisingly slowly. It's kind of like carbon won't be a very good inflation hedge in a decarbonizing world. I don't think you've invited me onto this conference to say that. Isn't it an obvious thing to say? But look at the real asset inflation sensitive allocations of large USA investors. They are not set up for a decarbonizing world. So I think we need to realize that neutral is a bad place to be. Something that Al Gore said, whether it's an equity index in a carbon-based economy or core infrastructure, whatever that is, and we need to redefine the infrastructure asset class. We need to reimagine inflation, and I touched on this earlier. We also need to redefine what risk is, because it really isn't volatility, the efficient an optimal number on an efficient frontier, which is transient and fake anyway. So it's everyone sort of talks about long-termism, but that's what we're really trying to do. We're realizing that you need to be different to the crowd, because, as I said, neutral is a bad place to be. So you want managers with high tracking error, and we're doing a lot of work, and our real assets group is doing a lot of work on reimagining infrastructure for the 21st century. And it's not about oil and gas and core, and again, sustainable timber. We've touched on that, is a big part of that. One of the barriers there, of course, is illiquidity. A lot of these funds, someone asked in the chat, what are you specifically talking about? Well, we're talking specifically about replanting degraded areas with lots of trees. So it's greenfield planting. What does that mean? It means it takes longer to get your yield, and you want to have, long-lived, more permanent forestry products than just pulp, so that it's long-lived storage. So this means, you want a longer-lived fund. You don't want to be chopping the trees down in year 9 to close the fund. So that can be a challenge. Liquidity budgets are stretched. Lots of the capital calls are coming so fast for private equities, so that can be a challenge. But we think the challenges are more perceived than real, because certainly all of our clients that are on this journey are doing really well in investing. The opportunities are there. So yeah, it's about redefining asset allocation and redefining risk.
Let's come back to that question on risk in a moment, but I wanted to just follow up with Kat on something that you mentioned, Chris, on sort of you began talking a little bit about sort of functionally how this works. And Kat, I wonder if you could just share a little bit about how natural climate solutions work in practice. That is, what are the things that actually contribute to climate mitigation, and how do those activities, or how can those activities, if they're well designed, also support or address the biodiversity crisis?
Sure, happy to. Among various other environmental benefits, through the collaboration that TIG and the Nature Conservancy have launched, we do think that there's a big opportunity here to provide high quality carbon offsets that provide additive climate benefits. So, the question is, well, what does that actually look like? That looks like managing forests differently. And each forest has its own context, has its own species composition. There's different ways that we're going to manage these forests to create these climate benefits and increase carbon storage. But some of those things are through delayed harvest or selective thinning, other types of activities that can really boost the biomass production in ways that sequester more carbon, but also allow for a vibrant business. So it really varies site to site what those activities on the ground in a working forest will look like. They can also look like land protection, setting aside part of the forest as a conservation zone, or putting a conservation easement on parts of the portfolio, and really allowing parts of those forests that are most important for biodiversity protection to really take on their natural rhythms. I think it's also just, a couple other things I'll say on carbon. As with the Nature Conservancy's other forest carbon projects, which we have hundreds of thousands of acres that we advise on across the US, our approach in this collaboration is to apply the best available science, acknowledging that science is constantly evolving, right? And to ensure that we will be complying with third-party standards, leading standards in the industry. Those, of course, are also constantly evolving. But really, I think that's one of the main, our main goals in this collaboration, but also just more broadly, making sure that we're continuing to kind of push and evolve the science and how we're all thinking about carbon markets. So we will be working with TIG over the coming years to identify the best opportunities for increasing carbon storage, alongside other ways to create environmental benefits on TIG properties. So, we've talked a little bit about climate resilience. We're really trying to think through connectivity opportunities. How do we use forests to both provide climate benefits, but also protect the species that we all care about?
Thank you. And maybe there's a risk conversation to have, and maybe we can come back to that connectivity issue in particular there. But I wanted to ask a question from the audience to Adam and Chris. Kat has talked about science and standards, and Adam, you mentioned sort of all of the complexity in the markets and how challenging that can be to navigate. And that raises the question, of course, as investors are working towards these goals, how are they thinking about, or how can one effectively measure progress? How can one measure these complicated systems or complicated impacts? What are the ESG metrics and tools that are available to make sure that we're actually making the progress that we're aiming towards?
Chris, why don't you go first this time?
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, I mean, it definitely isn't carbon emissions per $1 million invested in your portfolio. I think we need to differentiate, we between selling high carbon assets to someone else, which is great, but doesn't remove a single kilogram of carbon from the atmosphere, and underlying actions that are actually having a tangible impact on the real world. So, we're looking beyond making the portfolio look good. It's important from a risk point of view to have a well-aligned portfolio, but we're increasingly looking at the exposure to solutions. So in liquid markets, there's lots of tools where you can track exposure to environmental solutions. In private markets, we're increasingly working with managers, who are working with impact management project to actually, and Adam will be able to talk about this with much more depth than me. But the challenges of standardized solid impact reporting there are many. We've backed some interesting new funds this year where the carried interest is linked to the impacts that are achieved, which is super interesting because someone has to agree what they are and they have to actually clearly define what the outcomes are because money's involved. So that's been quite exciting. And there's some funds backed by the EIB, the European Investment Bank, that has developed some amazing frameworks for really nailing down what the impact is. So we're doing a lot of that. Beyond that, we're using a lot of climate scenario analysis tools to look at forward-looking alignment with 1.5-degree scenarios. Concepts like climate value at risk. What's the hit to my portfolio, both from physical climate risk and transition risk against high carbon assets? Net of investment in solutions. So there are many ways to measure it, but it's never easy, especially in private markets.
Mark, I'll just double click on a couple of those points. I think one is to underscore Chris's point about the manager putting their money where their mouth is on this point. And it's one of the things that, I don't know if, can I talk about the structure? No?
We can save that for an offline conversation, perhaps.
Okay. Well, anyway, I'm impressed with the structure of what TIG and TNC are doing because at a very high level, it does that, and so that's one of the signals that private investors can look to is the GP or the fund manager putting their own financial interest in line with the stated environmental goals. And then, yes, it's more, you're the one who said it, right? It's more complicated than that. And that is particularly the case with impact management. But I think at a very high level, one of the questions that our investors are often asking these days is around additionality or contribution as we see this kind of convergence of commercial investing with those who have a environmental focus as a primary goal. Our members are asking, if I don't make this investment, will it happen anyway from a commercial investor or a purely commercially minded investor? And if the answer to that question is yes, then I might move on and look at the next deal to find a place where I feel or we feel we can have a greater additionality.
Yeah, that's an interesting, usually in the carbon discussion, we talk about additionality, sort of a technical term in terms of whether an action is really making a change out in the world from a climate perspective, but from a broader impact perspective, you can see how the same principle applies. I wanted to come back to discussion about risk, and this obviously risk is a broad and complicated and fascinating discussion, and this may be too big a question to answer, but I'll ask it and see how you all what you all have to say. But I don't mean to put you on the spot. But in thinking about risk, a changing climate obviously creates all kinds of risks that are in some respects difficult to anticipate, and I think that that's something that around the world individuals are starting to feel in a new way with these sort of intensifying storms and other sort of natural disasters that are affecting people directly in ways that they may not have felt so directly affected in the past. But how do you all think about, or how do and this is maybe I'll start with Chris and Adam and then follow up with Kat. But how are your investors thinking about climate risk and what that will mean going forward in their allocation decisions? Is that something that is yet permeating sort of everything that you do, or is this something which is still very much developing?
I think it's still developing. I was working last week with a client that has very clear policies, and we've writing to every manager about how they're thinking about their own decarbonisation, climate risk, and also physical risk, because that's an area where there are interesting models where people have mapped spatial data to financial data to plot physical risks to listed companies, supply chains, increasingly things like real estate portfolios, loan books of banks, insurance books of, but the data's not great. I talked about climate value at risk scenario analysis models. The data's getting better, but it's not perfect. So it's an evolving conversation, but you know, the tools are getting better, and it's an increasingly part of the discussion that we're having with all investors.
And Adam, maybe I'd ask that same question to you.
You know, I think I see our members increasingly viewing themselves as universal owners, even if they aren't, you know, managing portfolios of the size where they literally own every stock in the, you know, on the markets, with the sense that it becomes much more about managing beta risk than managing alpha risk. Climate risk, you know, we can't solve this problem by fine-tuning our own portfolio specifically to mitigate our contribution to the problem and then, you know, declare victory and go home. But rather, if we've outsourced, you know, all of the nasties to other owners, what have we really accomplished on a net basis? And so I think this kind of thinking about risk at a systemic level or a beta level is increasingly something that I see our members and investors starting to do.
Fascinating and in many respects encouraging. I mean, as big a challenge as that is. Kat, I just want to make sure to follow up on something that you showed in your slides and this question of risk. One of the ways that I think, and please, you can speak to this far better than I can, but I think that one of the ways that risk shows up in the conservation science around natural climate solutions is around a focus on goals like connectivity and around building landscapes that are much broader than individual investments that are resilient, that can support sort of a climate changing world. Could you just talk a little bit more about that, or correct that if I have that wrong, but talk a little bit about how natural climate solution investment can support sort of the risk adaptation of these natural systems?
Sure thing. So, you know, I'd say in terms of risk within the conservation community, the changing world that we're working in and living in really requires that I think we increase our risk tolerance and that we explore new strategies, new types of collaborations, and that, you know, we're open to doing business differently as well. And so one of the things that that we're trying to do on that front is to really shift the thinking to really large landscape level resilience. So what is, you know, what are the things that we can look at and help position the natural world for that will lead to likely resilience under, you know, climate change 100 years from now. And so the scientific assessment that I showed earlier really takes a very large scale look at, okay, what are those pathways for connectivity that are going to allow the species that we care about to adapt to climate change, to move across the landscape? What are those differences in kind of microclimates, topography and things like that allow organisms to move on a small scale and on a large scale to respond to climate change and the different conditions that will bring. And so what that's given us, you know, across the country is a pretty good vision for very large landscape level conservation. And we can't buy our way as a land trust to that vision. We need to be working in, you know, working forests, in agricultural landscapes, in rivers. And so that's, you know, that's what in part brings us to the collaboration with TIG, is to try to really begin to work in collaborations that allow us to get to that scale.
Yeah, that's, I guess, you know, a robust protected area network is only so effective if the climate stays where it was, right? But in a moving climate, you need to be able to move with it. We're almost out of time, and so I just want to ask sort of a quick wrap-up question to each of our panelists. That is, if in 5 years or 10 years, we've actually made our way to the path to a Paris-aligned future. If actually we managed to make this kind of a transition, I'll start with you, Chris, and then you, Adam, and then finally Kat. But Chris, to you and Adam, what is it that what is the most important thing that you think the investor community that you work with at large, what is the most important thing that they need to do now to get ourselves to that climate aligned path 10 years from now?
I think it's to use their collective power to engage with the entire investment management industry, who in turn need to invest with the whole corporate sector to set credible net zero decarbonisation targets and be held to account on them, with interim and long-term targets. There's some amazing, people in the world, like Chris Hone, biggest hedge fund manager, probably couldn't spell the word climate 5 years ago. Now he's, spending 150 million of his own money on it. And he's created this Say on Climate initiative where he's essentially has an aspiration that every single listed company will have clear decarbonisation targets. And he's putting his money where his mouth is. He's demanding it from his entire portfolio. The power for that, right now, 70% of the world's GDP is from a country that has a 2050 or better net zero target, but the graph keeps going up. So we need more sustained collective action to, see this happening. And the power of investors here is huge.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with the power of a single question on a due diligence questionnaire to a manager can prompt all kinds of changes. Adam, same question to you. What do you think is the most important thing for the folks that you work with in the Tonic Network and more generally to do to get us on that path?
I'm going to pick engage. Because so much of the focus in impact investing is about investment selection, when you buy and when you sell and so forth, we tend to, and because of the tragedy of the commons, as expressed in investing in large cap stocks, we figure somebody else will deal with the engagement part. And I think this whole movement has gotten a real boost from engine number one and what happened with Exxon, what seems to be happening with Chevron, with people actually believing that engagement can make a difference. Engagement at that, very high investment level, engagement at the simple level of voting your proxies. And so, as I said before, we're not going to be able to, portfolio select our way out of the climate crisis. We have to think about the market as a whole. And if exit isn't an option, either from a particular basket of equities or the planet, then our best way forward is to engage with those that we own and the asset managers that hold them for us to change the world.
Terrific, thank you. And then Kat, the last question to you, what do you think is the most important thing for the conservation community to do to get us on that path to Paris?
I think we need to be having a lot of these same kinds of conversations and collaborations. I've seen day to day in working in similar types of collaborations to the one that we're launching now with TIG, fantastic benefits in really changing the way that the conservation organizations and investment firms are doing business. So in exchanging ideas and just being in the day-to-day, grunt work together, solving problems together, sharing different perspectives, our approaches evolve, right? And we need that evolution to solve the problems at the scale that they exist. I've experienced us being faster to innovate, quicker to move on from ideas and approaches that just simply don't work, and more open to change. And I think we all need that to tackle these problems. And so those collaborations and those conversations are absolutely critical.
Well, thank you for that. Well, we're at time. So I just want to end by giving a huge thanks to our panelists, to Kat and Adam and Chris. Thank you to all of the attendees for participating in the event today. And of course, thank you to TIG and to TNC for hosting and for the launch of this collaboration. Have a good day, everyone.